Alrighty, microclass, we are getting down to the wire. Today we are going to complete chapter 19, which is the digestive system. On Wednesday, we will look at chapter 20, and then a week from today, we're going to finish up our lecture for the semester. We're going to finish up chapter 21, and then next Wednesday, May 6th, will be your final exam. Okay, and I can't remember if I announced to you guys or not, but the final exam will be just like the previous exams that we've taken on mastering. You will have a set number of minutes to take the final exam, and then other than that, you'll have basically, you can start it at any time on May 6th. So you don't have to take it from that 1 to 3 p.m. time slot that we originally had scheduled for the final exam. So you can take it at any time. I'll open it up at midnight, close it at 11:59 p.m. But again, remember, once you start it, you will only have so many minutes to complete it since it's going to be online and so forth. So also remember, Chapters 16 through 21, the disease unit, will comprise 25% of your final, and I will post a review sheet up on D2L for that. And then the other 75% of your final will be cumulative from chapters 1 through 15. Okay, and I will not have a special review sheet for the 75% of the final. For that one, just use your old review sheets, old exams, and things like that. If you have any questions or concerns about the final, definitely reach out to me. Okay, so chapter 19 today. I originally had cut out quite a bit of material in these disease chapters, and including this one, so that we could do some fun in-class things and look at each disease a little bit more in depth and hands-on. But unfortunately, we're not together, so we're not going to be able to do that. So I feel like I'm kind of shortchanging you a little bit on these disease units. And so if you're going into healthcare and this is something that you're interested in, please feel free to go through and read about some of the other diseases that we're not going to cover. Okay. All right, so just starting out with the digestive system diseases, just real briefly about the digestive system for those that maybe have not had A&P. So the digestive system, its function is to bring in nutrients through the foods that we eat and break those down mechanically and chemically into their single units, like we talked way back in the beginning of the semester. For example, starches are big long chains of glucose molecules. So the digestive system takes starches and breaks it into glucoses. It takes proteins and breaks it into amino acids. And those individual units, those monomers, can be absorbed across the small intestine for the most part and taken to the bloodstream, and that blood will then take those nutrients to the body, to the cells that need it. So that's the job of the digestive system. The digestive system consists of basically the digestive tract, or the gastrointestinal tract, which is what this stands for, or it's also called the alimentary canal, and that's basically the tube that food flows through from the mouth all the way through to the other end. Okay. It also consists of the accessory organs, and in A&P we define these as organs that the food doesn't necessarily touch, but they assist with digestion in some way, like salivary glands and the liver. Food does not flow through the liver, but the liver produces enzymes and other substances that help break down foods like fats and things like that. The gallbladder will store bile that's produced by the liver. The pancreas is very, very important. It's going to release digestive enzymes to help break down those foods chemically. And as we saw, the digestive system is surrounded by lots of different lymphatic tissues, like the tonsils. Here's the appendix. It's part of the digestive system, but it's also part of the lymphatic system. Peyer's patches, which are like little lymph node type tissue down by the small intestines and so forth. And so these are present there because the digestive system can be a major portal of pathogen entry. And so the lymphatic system, remember, does a lot of, is a place where white blood cells do surveillance, the phagocytes and so forth. And so that is why the digestive system is surrounded by so much lymphatic tissue. Also, the lymphatic capillaries called lacteals absorb fats and help get that to the bloodstream as well. So we know probably from just normal everyday experiences, but also things that we've learned in this course so far, that the digestive system has tons and tons of microbes. Okay, we've talked about microbes in the mouth, okay, microbes that live on the teeth and the gums, and there's a lot of different stuff that lives in the mouth. There's over 500 different types of bacteria that have been identified as living in the human mouth. The small and large intestines have a lot of bacteria in them as well. They have, as we've talked before, a lot of different functions, from releasing and producing vitamins for our bodies to absorb. They produce odors and kind of ferment some of the foods that we cannot digest, and they live off of that. Very few organisms live in the stomach because of its pH. It's typically around about a pH 2, which is very acidic. And so very few microbes can live there, but H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori, can live there. And it is what causes ulcers, peptic ulcers, stomach ulcers. We're not going to talk about those this semester. You're welcome to read about it, but they basically, when they are in infectious mode, they will burrow through the mucosal layer and the basically a mucus layer that protects the stomach from the acid. They will basically burrow through that. They will infect the lining of the stomach, and those acids can then pour in to the lining of the stomach and cause damage and cause the ulcers. Strep is a big one that's on the teeth, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute, how bacteria can cause cavities, or how they do cause cavities. Strep mutans is a big one that's going to be involved in cavity formation. Okay, so our normal gut microbes, we have lots and lots of them, and in the gut, I mean the small and large intestine. They're really important. Okay, remember, not all microbes are bad. Most of them, either help us, or we have, no real interaction with them. They don't help us or they don't hurt us. Okay, only a few of them actually are pathogenic. And so our normal gut microbes are helpful and beneficial. Remember, they're going to compete for nutrients. They're going to compete for space and help protect us against pathogenic organisms. They're going to excrete antimicrobial products. And these are all going to help limit pathogen growth in our digestive system. So remember these antimicrobial products. Remember, some antibiotics are produced by microbes themselves. Okay, could be a fungus, could be other bacteria. Streptomyces produces a lot of antimicrobial products, chemicals that are used to make antibiotics or semi-synthetics. So our good normal microbiota are really trying there, and they help us protect ourselves from pathogens by outcompeting them and keeping their numbers limited. They can assist in digestion. And then E. coli, Escherichia coli, can help take our foods and produce vitamin K that can be absorbed by our large intestine and used in our body. And vitamin K helps with blood clotting and other things as well. So, uh, we've talked a little bit before about how there are studies about our microbiome and how they impact uh, other body functions. And so there's a huge area in microbiology research right now looking at impacts on gut microbiota, on our metabolism, on obesity, on depression and other diseases. And there's some very interesting things that they are discovering, that people with depression have a different gut microbiome profile, or different types of microbes that live in their gut, than people that are not suffering from depression, or people with diabetes versus not with diabetes. And so they're kind of trying to figure out, like, which came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing. Did the imbalance in the, or the differences in the gut microbes cause the depression, or did the depression cause the difference in the microbes? And so they're looking at links like that. They're looking at links with obesity to see if you can adjust the microbe profile in the gut, if that will have any effect on obesity. Or if you have certain microbes that live in your gut, does that predispose you more for obesity than if you didn't have those? And so that's a huge area of research right now, and a lot of information coming out on that. Gut microbes, as well as our other normal microbes around the body, are going to help train and modulate, or basically train and get the immune system ready, and help the immune system make appropriate responses. Few terms here: memberitis, inflammation of, entero or entero refers to the small intestine, usually. Gastric, gast refers to the stomach, so gastritis, inflammation of the stomach. Enteritis is intestinal inflammation. And then gastroenteritis is inflammation of both. Dysentery. If you ever played that Santa Fe Trail computer game in elementary school, and you were on the Santa Fe Trail and all of your people died because of dysentery. Dysentery is severe gastroenteritis, but it's different from regular diarrhea or regular or other types of gastroenteritis, because the diarrhea is painful and it contains blood and mucus. Okay, so normal diarrhea would just contain watery stool. This contains blood and mucus as well. Dehydration, you know what that is, excess water loss. But dehydration due to diarrhea, if it's extreme, can cause hypovolemic shock. So hypo means low, volemic refers to volume, and in this case, volume of the blood. And that can lead to shock and organ failure. So if you're so dehydrated that your normal blood volume decreases, your blood pressure will then decrease as well. And if your blood pressure gets so low, the body can go into shock and your organs will start to shut down. So severe diarrhea, severe dysentery can lead to hypovolemia, which is low blood volumes, and then shock and death because of organ failure could result. Most intestinal pathogens that cause diarrhea or dysentery or even vomiting are transmitted through the fecal oral route. Okay, so if you've ever had a stomach bug or food poisoning, things like that, what has happened is, most likely, is that food or drink or something that entered your mouth was contaminated with fecal microbes. Okay. So typically it's contaminated food or water. And each of us every day, no matter how well we wash our hands and things like that, we do get exposed to some fecal contamination on a fairly regular basis. Okay. If you live in other parts of the world, this increases a lot. Have you ever traveled to a foreign country or known someone who's traveled to a foreign country and they've been told don't eat certain types of foods that haven't been cooked, don't drink the water, this and that? That's because our immune systems are not regularly exposed to and haven't built up immunity to regular exposure to high levels and different types of fecal material in our food and water. The locals there are used to it and they have built up immunity in a lot of cases. But for us, if we haven't built up that immunity and we travel to that foreign country, you have to take precautions because of that fecal contamination due to, just less hygienic sewage, less regulated water regulations as far as safe drinking water, less restrictions on how foods are handled. Here, restaurants have to go, they get inspected by the health inspector. They will take temperatures to make sure the foods are properly stored in the correct temperatures, and making sure that employees wash their hands and things like that. And in other parts of the world, those are precautions are not taken or taken as stringently anyway. So hand washing, sewage management, water sanitation, regulations all help with fecal oral transmission, but it still can occur. Okay, so I have skipped the viral digestive diseases. Again, I apologize about that. I had planned on doing some other things in class that we can't really do remotely. So if you're interested, definitely go check some of those out. Some of those that we're going to skip that are significant in the United States is the norovirus, rotavirus. There's an oral vaccine that young children get for rotavirus, and then hepatitis. Can you guys tell what hepatitis is? Inflammation of what? Hepa or hepato refers to the liver. So these would be like hepatitis A, B, C. There's some others as well that cause inflammation of the liver. Okay, but dental caries, or caries is a fancy word for cavities. Okay, and these next few diseases are going to be bacterial. So again, I apologize for skipping a lot of the viral or all of the viral ones, but we'll focus on a few of the bacterial diseases. Dental caries in the US is very prevalent. And I usually ask you guys like, hey, who's never had a cavity? And once in a while, I'll have a student that's never had a cavity, but pretty much everyone has had them before. And to be honest, cavities back, 1,000 years ago and longer, dental caries or cavities was a leading cause of death because people would, they didn't have dental care. I mean, dental care is really just picked up in the last 75 years or less. And so people would get a cavity, and we'll talk about how this works here in just a little bit, but bacteria would get down in there and destroy the tooth and then begin to form an abscess. And then they didn't have antibiotics to treat it. They didn't really know. And so the bacteria would get in and cause a systemic blood infection, and the person would die. And they have found skulls, jawbones of people where the jawbone is nearly disintegrated away because of the abscess, because of the bacterial infection. And then it would spread to other parts of the body or to the to the blood and spread through other parts of the body and cause death. So remember, dental plaque is a prime example of the biofilm that we've talked about many times in class. And that biofilm is that sticky community of microbes living together. They're all stuck together with sugars and peptides and dead bacteria and all kinds of different things, mucus and so forth, that holds the bacteria together, holds them and sticks them onto a surface like the surface of the tooth, and then protects the inner layers, and then they can actually start quorum sensing or talking to one another and change some of their genetics and start to become pathogenic and do different things. And so Streptococcus mutans, actinomycetes, Veillonella, Haemophilus, those will all stick together and form that biofilm on the outside of the tooth. Okay, now that tooth can, that dental plaque will hold the bacteria close to the tooth, okay? And you know, the reason that you shouldn't eat sugars is because the bacteria, like strep mutans, will metabolize those sugars, and their waste product is acids. And so as they're metabolizing the sugars, they're producing acids, and those acids erode away the enamel, the outer portion. I'll show you a picture of a second, the outer portion of your tooth. Okay, so if you're drinking acidic foods, if you drink soda a lot, that acid in the soda is compounding the acid that's produced by the bacteria. Okay, and also if you're drinking soda with sugar in it, or sugary drinks, or eating a lot of sugary foods, you're just feeding those bacteria to produce more acids, which wear away the enamel on your teeth. Okay, and then the infection gets deeper and deeper into the tooth, and then it could cause an abscess, and you'll need to get that cavity fixed for your well-being. So here is the bacteria. They will, well, they didn't show a picture yet, but they'll start and they'll kind of form that biofilm right here, or a lot of times in between the teeth where you can't brush. That's why it's important to floss, is to pull that plaque up out of there. But the bacteria will start releasing those acids as they're fermenting the sugars that are coming through in the mouth. And if you don't get that, the dentist will come in here and drill this out and get rid of the dead kind of infected type of enamel and fill it with a filling. And that will prevent, you know, any more damage. But if it's not treated like 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, that damage will continue into the dentin, which is the orange layer here of the tooth, and it can continue into the pulp, which contains blood vessels and nerves, and that will become extremely painful. And then you can get an abscess down here. This white part is the jawbone, where the tooth is kind of anchored into that jawbone there. This is the gingiva, or your gums, this pink area here. And so you can get that abscess form, and then as that abscess grows, it can wear away on the bone. And then also notice down here, this is where the blood vessels go out and join larger blood vessels in the jaw and so forth. And so these bacteria can leave and travel around the body and cause problems and even death if really left untreated. Let's see. So brushing removes the bacteria. Okay, sometimes my kids in the morning will be like, oh, I'm just gonna mouthwash and I don't have bad breath, and you know, that's good enough. I'm like, no, you have to brush, because the mouthwash just gets the outer layer of the biofilm, okay? You have to mechanically scrub those bacteria off with your toothbrush and with your flosser or piece of floss to get them out. You have to physically remove them, okay? And then after that, if you want to do mouthwash, that's a great idea if that works for you. But bacteria regrows, right? Every morning you wake up with the little filmy stuff in your mouth, perhaps, okay? So they have to do it multiple times a day. If that plaque hardens, that's called tartar. It gets kind of calcifies, and that's when you go to the dentist and you get your cleaning and they take the little scraper and pick off the tartar. Okay, so the best way to prevent cavities is brushing and flossing. Seeing your dentist, having sealants, limiting sugary foods and acidic drinks like juices and Gatorade, tea, pop, those kinds of things. A lot of water systems, a lot of public water systems will have fluoride in the water system to help harden and mineralize the tooth to kind of help it basically defend against those bacteria a little bit more. So that's dental caries, also known as cavities. And this is probably not good, but I'm thirsty and I'm drinking a soda. Not a good idea. Should be drinking water. I will brush my teeth later. So next we're going to move into some more bacterial diseases. Bacteria and viruses as well, but bacteria are a common cause of foodborne illness, and 1 in 6 Americans every year, according to the CDC, will get some sort of foodborne illness. Norovirus is the most common causative agent, and then bacteria are really important as well. And again, remember fecal contamination. Oh, it was last winter, I forget, they closed down a school in the Western Slope because of the norovirus. And what can happen there in school settings, and a lot of times with those stomach bugs like norovirus, is people will maybe not quite know they're sick yet, or maybe not feel too bad. They'll go to the bathroom, not wash their hands real well, or maybe they'll touch something before they wash their hands after they've gone to the bathroom, and then someone else will come in, they'll get it on their hands, and then it gets onto their food or into their mouth or in their cup or whatever, and that's how it kind of gets passed around. Let's see. So there's a couple of types of foodborne illness, okay? So there's foodborne infection, which, remember, infection is when the bacteria are present in the body and they start to metabolize and reproduce and basically use our cells as nutrients, okay? So that's foodborne infection. Okay, then there's food poisoning, or also called intoxication, because you've taken in a toxin. Okay, so here's some differences between the two, and these are something you'll need to know for the test, the final. So foodborne infection, the pathogen develops the infection. It's going to reproduce and live off of your cells. Okay, could be things like Campylobacter, Shigella, E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria are some examples. Okay, so eating raw eggs, okay, or eating the cookie dough, things like, I've eaten so much cookie dough, I'm probably immune to it. Don't tell anybody that either. Okay, usually takes a day or a little bit longer for the incubation period and before you get your symptoms. Okay. Symptoms would include like a fever, headache, muscle aches, nausea, diarrhea, cramping, or abdominal pain, and it may take a couple days or a few weeks to get over that. Food poisoning, however, usually lasts just a few hours, okay? It's like a 24-hour thing. Most common, you just have vomiting and diarrhea. Maybe some cramps. You don't necessarily have a fever or a headache or just that rundown fatigue type of a situation. Food poisoning hits you pretty fast within a couple of hours, and it's caused by toxins, not an infection. So staph, Bacillus cereus, Clostridium perfringens, those types of toxins. Okay, so you didn't necessarily eat the bacteria, and those are causing the infection. They may be already dead, but it's the toxin that causes the illness. You don't get an infection, you just have ingested the toxin, and those toxins are persisting in your system and causing problems. Okay, so here we'll start out with the foodborne infections. Okay, bacteria are living in the GI tract, probably stomach, small intestine, or large intestine. And again, we talked about some of those species there. Your book talks about each of those. Campylobacter, Shigella, Salmonella, a lot of these you can get from like raw milk. I don't know, pasteurize your milk, kills all the pathogens. But food poisoning is caused by enterotoxin. Okay, so enterotoxin, entero, remember, means intestinal, is a type of exotoxin. Okay, so it's a toxin that's released by the bacteria. Don't get that confused with endotoxin, which is that lipid A from gram negatives. Okay, that's totally different. That is found in the cell wall of gram negative bacteria. Enterotoxin specifically attacks the intestine, okay, and it's a type of released exotoxin. Okay, these toxins may be emetic, which means it causes vomiting, causes inflammation of the intestinal cells because it's a toxin, and by definition a toxin causes damage to cells, and so the intestinal cells are going to be damaged, which causes inflammation, and that can cause problems with water absorption. Okay, in the large intestine, well, water is absorbed from when you drink a glass of water. Water is going to be absorbed a little bit from the stomach, a tiny bit from the small intestine, and then a lot of it's going to be absorbed from the large intestine. And so if water absorption is prevented, if you can't get water out of your GI tract and into the blood, it's going to stay there. Okay, and the more water you have there, the more runny or loose the stools are going to be because they're going to have higher water content. Okay, so that's going to lead to diarrhea. And that diarrhea, that inflammation, all of that can lead to cramping and abdominal discomfort. Okay, typically we see food poisoning with foods that require a lot of handling, and also foods that are that have like dairy products in them, like the coleslaw or the potato salad that sits out, those types of things. Leaving foods at room temperature for long periods of time allow those bacteria to reproduce, and the more they reproduce, the more toxins that can be excreted by those bacteria. And a lot of times, like if you leave the food out at room temperature and toxins build up, and then you go and you cook it. So say you put some raw meat on the counter and you left it for 6 hours, okay? And it was able to come up to room temperature. Those bacteria are going to produce the toxins, and then if you thoroughly cook that meat, or maybe you reheat the leftovers or whatever that you let set out overnight, that's not necessarily going to destroy the enterotoxin. It might kill the bacteria, but it may not destroy the toxin, and you still may get sick from that. Leading causes of food poisoning, we talked about those. Staph aureus, the toxins produced by those are going to be found in like your dairy, or creamy things like the potato salad, things that have mayonnaise or Miracle Whip in them, and if you let them sit out. Those are high-risk foods that you don't want to let sit out. If you do, don't eat them. Clostridium perfringens. We saw these guys, cause gangrene. They can also, their toxins, if they're ingested, can also cause food poisoning, Bacillus cereus on unwashed vegetables and things like that. Botulism is another one that we've talked about. And this, Aspergillus flavus, is a fungus. That can cause, I think it's a fungus. Look that up. Sorry, should have done that. That can cause toxin production as well. Next, we're going to talk about E. coli gastroenteritis, and this would be an infection, and they can also release toxins. So the E. coli may live in the body and also produce what's called a Shiga-like toxin. E. coli, we remember from the gram staining lab, is a gram negative, so it would be a pink in the gram stain, kind of help remembering for the final. They're motile, which means they have flagella and they can move from one place to the next, and they are bacilli. They are very, very common microbes that live in mammal guts, so humans, cows, cats, dogs, all of those kinds of things. And most E. coli are not harmful. Remember, they help with vitamin K. Okay, most are not pathogenic, but some strains can be very, very pathogenic, very, very infectious, and cause some severe illness. And E. coli and other microbes can be categorized based on their virulence factors, like what toxins they produce. And remember, virulence factors are basically ways they cause harm or evade the immune system. So it could be toxins, ways they hide from the phagocytes, all those types of things. And so E. coli is different strains of pathogenic E. coli strains are kind of grouped together based on their virulence factors, and that is called a pathotype or a pathovar. And there's 6 main pathovars that cause diarrhea. Diarrheagenic means they cause diarrhea. And these pathovars or pathotypes are grouped based on their O and H antigens. So remember, with the flu virus, we had like H1N1. Okay, those were the antigens or the spikes on the outside of the virus. Okay, there are antigens that they've labeled O and H to identify different types of E. coli. They're going to be transmitted from the fecal-oral route because they have to get from the intestines of one mammal to the mouth and the upper digestive tract of the next mammal and cause problems. Let's see, each pathotype is going to have very specific symptoms, disease severity, and different types of treatments. The one that we're going to mainly focus on is O157H7, and this seems to be at this point the most severe type of E. coli pathovar that causes diseases and causes problems in humans. And your book talks about Shigella bacteria before this section, and Shigella bacteria produce what's called a Shiga toxin. And so if you're interested, you can go back and read about Shiga toxin. But the Shiga toxin bacteria, like E. coli O157H7, are called STEC, or Shiga toxin producing E. coli. And these are going to be the most common dysentery. Okay, so they're going to have blood and mucus in the stool. in the US. One thing that is notable about them is that they are resistant to the stomach acids, which is a pH 2. So if you consume them, they can pass, the bacteria can pass through the stomach and go to the small intestine and start living and producing toxins. There have been, you've probably heard of hamburger recalls and different types of food, vegetable recalls, juices that are unpasteurized can be, excuse me, ways that E. coli 157H7 is transmitted, and also from petting zoos. Where you go in, you pet the animal had fecal contamination on it, you know, because there's manure everywhere. And well, not necessarily the animals may be clean, but you get it. And then the kid doesn't wash their hands and they eat a corn dog at the fair or whatever, and then they're sick. So transmission, you know, in cattle also, I hate that cattle get blamed for this all the time. Deer and humans and other organisms can have E. coli 0157H7. It's just cattle have been mostly done the most research on them. But if cattle manure contaminates the ground beef, okay, and this sounds really gross, but it doesn't, like, it's not like they're putting poop in the feed or in the ground beef, but there can be, you know, maybe a piece of hair that had fecal contamination from the hide of the animal might blow around and then accidentally fall in or something like that. That's how that could happen. Agricultural runoff, field workers going to the bathroom in the field can transmit E. coli 0157H7. Deer contaminated, goes to the bathroom in a vegetable field. Those types of things. There can be person-to-person transmission as well. And the infective dose is very low, anywhere between 10 and 100 cells is all it takes for the signs and symptoms to develop from that. Okay. So some signs and symptoms of E. coli 0157H7: abdominal pain, watery diarrhea at first, and then bloody diarrhea, and not necessarily a fever. Typically in a healthy person, it will resolve within about a week. But for children, someone that's immunocompromised and so forth, there is a risk for HUS, and that stands for hemolytic. Okay, so hemolysis, okay, right? Bursting red blood cells. Uremic syndrome. Okay, and this causes blood in the urine and can lead to kidney failure. And this occurs in about 10% of patients. And if this is severe enough, that this can lead, E. coli 0157H7 can lead to death. But again, for most healthy people, it's going to resolve within about a week, and the person will recover. The next disease is cholera. And we don't really see this a lot in the US. In 2012 in Haiti, when they had an earthquake or a hurricane, I don't remember off the top of my head. Terrible. I think it was an earthquake. I don't know. Anyway, there was a huge cholera outbreak. To make matters worse, some health aid workers from Europe came over and accidentally brought cholera with them, and then it spread throughout the disaster zone. And so we'll just talk a little bit about cholera. We don't vaccinate for it here in the US because it's very, very rare. But if you do travel to areas where there's an endemic outbreak, then you may want to go ahead and get the vaccine. But cholera is caused by Vibrio cholerae. And remember, Vibrios, well, that looks terrible, are a curved shaped rod. They're gram negative and they have a flagella. And again, this is something that we don't necessarily see a lot in the US. It's more typically in less developed countries. Another thing about Vibrio cholerae is that they like alkaline environments. So they can live in bodies of water that are alkaline, and those can serve as their reservoirs. Transmission in endemic areas where there's a lot of prevalence usually deals with poor water sanitation. In the US, the common way of getting it is from raw shellfish consumption. This infectious dose is higher than E. coli 0157H7, and that's about 1 million. Salmonella takes about 1 million as well for their infective dose, just to kind of as a side note there. Signs and symptoms of cholera, usually very quickly after you've consumed the contaminated food or water, you'll start to get the symptoms. Very severe, very watery diarrhea. And this diarrhea, we'll see here in a second, is what they call like rice water stool. It looks like there's like you've taken some cooked white rice and put it in water. That's what the diarrhea will look like. There's vomiting, a loss of electrolytes, dehydration, leg cramps because of the dehydration and lack of electrolytes as well. Remember, electrolytes are dissolved charged ions like sodium and chloride and calcium and things like that. And because of osmosis, water will either follow those electrolytes or pull those electrolytes with them as they leave in the stool. So how do Vibrio cholerae cause the disease? They will pass the stomach. They can go through the stomach, and then they will actually burrow in. I'll show you a diagram of this in a little bit, and invade the small intestine. And they will release what's called the cholera toxin. And the cholera toxin, let's see if I can draw this here. So here's the small intestine. Here's the layer of cells here that make up the lining of the small intestine. In this layer here, this toxin will cause those cells to pump electrolytes into the small intestine. And because of osmosis, that will draw water from the body into the small intestine as well. Okay, so the more that the toxin pump causes the cell to pump electrolytes, the more water that enters, the more diarrhea is produced. And as that inflammation, as the wall of the small intestine starts to break down, it starts to slough off. And so there are pieces of mucus and pieces of epithelial cells that end up in the diarrhea and form that ricey type appearance. In very severe cases, 20 liters of fluid can be excreted in a day. And typically, a person excretes about 2 liters of water per day. Okay, and that will change, you know, depending on how hydrated you are. So this is about 10 times as much water as what normally would be excreted. So you can become severely dehydrated very, very quickly if you're not receiving fluids. And a lot of times what happens is the patient will get cholera, they'll get severely dehydrated, and then they'll go and continue to consume the contaminated water from the contaminated water source, and that just exasperates the situation. So that dehydration can really lead to decreased blood volume, hypovolemic shock, and death, and so forth. So typically, what will basically be used to diagnose is the appearance of the stool, but you can also culture that to identify the Vibrio cholerae in the stool. Biggest part of treatment there will be rehydration, okay, drinking, getting an IV in, things like that. Antibiotics can be used, and then prevention is basically proper sewage treatment and proper water treatment. Okay, so if you're traveling, there is a vaccine that you could take, or if you're in an area where you're not quite sure, don't eat or drink anything that hasn't been properly handled. Okay, here's a snapshot. We'll let you guys look at that one on your own. The next disease that's bacterial that we'll talk about is C. diff, and we've talked about it a little bit so far in class, Clostridium difficile. And that bacteria, again, like all the other clostridials, is spore forming, so it produces an endospore. It's gram positive, like all the other Clostridia and Bacillus. Sorry, not Bacillus. And it is an anaerobe, just like botulism and tetanus and gangrene. They don't like air. They don't like, well, oxygen, okay? And C. diff is going to also produce some exotoxins. And a lot of the strains will produce what's called the A toxin and B toxin. So there's two different ones. And then there's another third type of another strains of bacteria that are starting to produce a third toxin, and that's still being researched. They're not 100% sure that toxin's mechanism of action yet, but it is something that we're starting to see emerge. And in the US, C. diff is becoming more common than MRSA. We hear a lot about MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, but there's actually more C. diff infections than MRSA. And about 500,000 people per year develop C. diff. About 30,000 of them pass away from that. And most of these are going to be healthcare associated or healthcare acquired infections. Okay, so they're gonna, most cases are gonna come from having a history of some sort of medical intervention, staying at a nursing home or staying in a hospital or having antibiotics. They're even seeing more and more non-HAI C. diff infections. So people that haven't necessarily been in the hospital or something like that. So C. diff endospores are common. They're they're just basically everywhere. And so those endospores can naturally just find their way to the digestive system, and our normal healthy microbes do a pretty good job of outcompeting them, okay? But when we take a high-powered antibiotic, or your body is stressed because of surgery or a hospital stay or whatever, that's when these C. diff endospores can basically germinate, come out of their dormant state and cause some disease. So once a patient has C. diff, it is very, very easily highly contagious because it is excreted in the feces. It can get in all kinds of places. It forms endospores, and so it can persist, and normal bleach and different things like that don't kill endospores. So usually they are going to end up happening after, toward the end of your antibiotic regimen. In mild cases, you might get a little diarrhea and some pretty good abdominal pain, but in more severe cases, you can get dysentery, fever, very, very abundant, lots of watery diarrhea, and then also what's called pseudomembranous colitis, and I have a picture of that here in just a second. So colitis is inflammation of the colon, which is another name for the large intestine. And the pseudomembranous part is basically that there's pus-filled vesicles or pus-filled, I don't know, membranous tissue that we'll see here in just a little bit. It's resistant to antibiotics because of the endospores and just the nature of the C. diff. And again, you know, we remove the competitors because of antibiotics, and that C. diff can really start to thrive. And so the toxins cause damage to the lining of the colon, and then you start to get these pus-filled membranous lesions here that develop, and it causes a lot of pain, and you get the diarrhea and so forth. This is what a healthy colon would look like. This is probably from a colonoscopy. And then this is the same view from an infected patient. One other complication that C. diff can cause is toxic megacolon. And oh shoot, we don't have a picture of that. I encourage you to Google this, and maybe in the video it might show as well. There's a couple videos. I don't have the list here. I think cholera, C. diff, and E. coli videos. So maybe, I forget if the video shows, but Google toxic megacolon. Basically what happens is the colon becomes so inflamed and damaged that it no longer participates in peristalsis. So basically when you swallow something and food hits the esophagus, your GI tract kind of massages, there's muscles in the lining that push food from one point to the next, okay, and just keeps pushing it. When the colon is inflamed like that, it basically stops moving the material, and so it called it a megacolon. It gets really large, and it builds up with feces and gas, and if it becomes very distended, and if it becomes too distended, it can burst, and then and that's called a perforation. And then the contents, the bacteria, all of that stuff can get in the abdominal cavity, just like if the appendix were to rupture, same sort of thing. That digestive material and all the bacteria would get in the abdominal cavity or the pelvic cavity, and can cause sepsis and death. Okay, so some treatments, if you're on a strong antibiotic, a lot of times they'll prescribe probiotics so that you're kind of trying to replace some of those normal microbes. And then also fecal transplants. This sounds really weird, but what they'll do is they'll take stool from a healthy patient, a healthy donor, I should say, and that has a good microbial profile, and they will actually transplant it into the person. You can take it in a pill form, or they can actually like implant it in there. It's basically like putting good bacteria into your gut so those good bacteria can outcompete. Let's see. Prevention, limit unnecessary precautions. If you do have a patient that has C. diff, you know, make sure you're washing your hands and doing a lot of hygienic practices. Okay, that's it for our bacterial section. I wanted to talk about some of the protozoal or one protozoal infection, and then we'll talk about a parasitic worm. But the protozoa and the worm, remember, are eukaryotes. Okay, so they're going to have cells more similar to ours than the prokaryotic bacteria. So we've talked about Giardia a little bit, giardiasis, and it's caused by the protist or the protozoa Giardia lamblia, and it has 2 stages to its life cycle. The trophozoite is the active stage where it's actively metabolizing and so forth. And then there's the cyst stage, which is dormant. And it's sort of like an endospore in bacteria, but it's not quite as resistant. They're very, very resistant. They're very high on that resistance scale up there with endospores, but they're not quite as resistant. And you basically get Giardia from ingesting the cyst. Okay, so the dormant stage. I think we've talked about this before. I've talked to you about my nieces and nephews that didn't even get in the water, drink the water, that got Giardia. Usually it's from contaminated water or from an animal to a person, causes diarrhea, flatulence, and vomiting. An animal reservoir for the Giardia is the beaver. So if there's a beaver living in a pond or a lake or stream or whatever, they can be shedding the bacteria there into the water. The cysts are resilient enough to pass through the stomach, through the acidic pH, and then the cyst will kind of like hatch or germinate and produce 2 active trophozoites. Okay, so here's the cyst and one of the trophozoites leaving there. And the trophozoites, I don't see a good picture, will actually have little suction discs, and they will suction on to the small intestine, and they will actually leave little scars once they have left. Here's their little flagella. They will feed off of the host, they'll reproduce, move out toward the colon, and be expelled in the feces to try to continue the life cycle. Usually 2 to 4, 2 to 6 weeks after the infection begins. Excuse me. Usually the body can fight that off on its own without treatment, but you can take an antiprotozoal called metronidazole, and that can help clear that infection up. It just takes as little as 10 of the cysts to cause an infection. So make sure that you filter water and be careful if you're around certain types of water sources that have not been treated. The last one that I wanted to talk about were tapeworms, just because I wanted to cover helminth, and that's a fancy word for parasitic worm. They're multicellular animals, so everything else that we've talked about are either viruses or unicellular organisms. These are multicellular organisms. They're eukaryotic, of course. Some of the adults you can see without a microscope, but we cover them in microbiology because of their eggs or larval stages that are microscopic. And these can either be roundworms or flatworms. And flatworms are like tapeworms. Or flukes, like a liver fluke or something like that. And we're not talking, when we say roundworm, we're not talking about earthworms. Okay, earthworms are not parasites. You could eat them. You can eat their eggs. That'd be gross, but they're not going to parasitize you. Roundworms are what we call nematodes. Okay, so we're not talking about earthworms here, but these are usually transmitted by eggs or larvae that had been in the soil that had been fecally contaminated by another organism. And I just wanted to mention tapeworms as one example, just so we covered one of the worms. But these are flatworms, and they have a head region called a scolex. And this scolex is going to have hooks and suckers so it can attach to the small intestine. And it doesn't have a mouth. It doesn't have eyes, anything like that. Basically, what they do is they absorb nutrients through their skin. As those nutrients pass by in our digestive tract. So as we're doing all the work digesting the food, they're sucking in or through diffusion, getting nutrients absorbing into their bodies and basically stealing our nutrients. Then behind the scolex, I'll show you this picture here. Here's the scolex. Okay, you should Google this too. You should check that out, what it looks like. But here's the scolex very far away. And then as this grows, and they can be over 20 feet long, certain types of tapeworms, they have these little segments here, and those are called proglottids. And proglottids are basically these little pieces that contain eggs. And when they break off, like this, as it gets longer, they'll start to break off, and then the mature ova, the mature eggs that are ready to kind of hatch, are deposited in the feces. Okay, so there's a couple of types of, there's several types of tapeworms, but you can get tapeworms from eating infected meat. Again, if you eat inspected by the state or USDA meat in the United States, that meat is thrown away if it's infected with tapeworms, and it'll have little cysts. In cattle, they'll call it cattle measles. I forget what they call it in pigs, but that whole carcass will be thrown away if that is infected with tapeworms. So your chances of getting those in the US are very, very slim unless you're like butchering your own meat and not discarding infected meats. So anyway, that is the digestive system chapter. There are a couple of videos to watch for credit, so make sure that you check those out. And next time we will talk about the urinary and reproductive system diseases. Okay, so if you have any concerns, let me know, and we will be back with